Hey, B-Siders. Welcome to another episode of Bravo for the B-Side. This is Jim.
This is Danny.
And we have with us today Alex Cox, the writer and director of Tombstone Rashomon. And we are so very excited. Hey, Alex. We are so excited to talk about this because Tombstone Rashomon does a number of things. It's a wonderful film.
It is.
And we love Tombstone history. I used to live in Arizona. I spent a lot of time making trips down to Tombstone just to talk.
Where did you live?
Lived first in Cottonwood. And then I ended up living in Flagstaff because I worked for the school district up there.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Nice.
But I loved the southern part of the state because hot open desert was my thing. And Tombstone's history, I mean, it just can't help but be a draw. Okay. So Tombstone Rashomon, we did an episode on it. And for those who listened, it is a telling of the events of the shootout at the OK Corral, legendary Earps and Clantons and McLowrys. It's a different take on it.
Yes.
Time traveling documentary crew ends up a day late, so they have to talk to people. And as we said in the episode, it's kind of framed after Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, which is become a term in psychology that is if you have 5 people in a room and they watch something happen, you can get 5 very different accounts of what happened. So very unique, very entertaining. And now we get to talk to the man who
wrote it and directed it.
Yep, made it happen. All right.
That would be me, yes.
So the first thing that we thought of, because we've seen many films from across the decades, from the 50s on to about Wyatt Earp, about the events at Tombstone, the shootout at the OK Corral, and mostly about Wyatt Earp. We've read some books, seen a lot of documentaries, and this just seemed quite interesting that it still would attract someone like you to approach as the subject matter. So basically, we just want to know up front what inspired you to approach the story of Tombstone and to do it in this way.
Well, I think my first encounter with it was with that Stuart N. Lake biography of Wyatt Earp, which was probably every school library at a certain point. So I read that, and so I'd been invested with the Wyatt Earp, perspective on these events, which the movies tend to give as well. But then when you research anything, it's more complicated than it was in a Hollywood movie. Or in a hagiography, even a very long hagiography. And the events of the gunfight are still argued over more, especially in Tombstone. I think in the rest of the world has kind of forgotten about the gunfight at the OK Corral. But in southern Arizona, they remember it. And in Tombstone, they obsess about it. And so there's a revisionist take on the whole thing now, which says that the Clantons were essentially innocent and the McLowrys were completely innocent and just got, it was just a bad day for them. So there are a lot of Clanton sympathizers in and around Tombstone, as you probably know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So what do you think? Are you on the side of the Clantons or are you on the side of the Earps?
I don't think there's really a way of knowing at this late stage in the game. All you can really do is watch these movies, or if you want to do the research, there are transcripts of the proceedings that happened after the killings at the OK Corral. It wasn't a grand jury proceeding, but it was a sort of an informal judge-based proceeding with a guy called Judge Spicer, I think, who was to decide whether or not the Earps and Holiday should be put before a grand jury and tried for murder. And if you read those proceedings, you get an idea of the personalities involved and who's telling the truth and maybe who's kind of massaging the truth, who's coordinated their stories beforehand. So doing that kind of research, you can certainly see that the official version of these events, in which the Earps are entirely good and they have this kind of good bad guy that goes along with them, Doc Holliday, who's also a deadly dentist, is a very simplistic view of a more complicated situation, which also comes down to a political war between Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That politics was a huge factor in this when it happened, and in how it was handled by the judge and by the sheriff and by everyone involved. So
and they were pretty much all part. Well, no, the judge was part of the Republican faction, which the Earps were part of as well, and the saloon keepers. But the cowboy faction was largely Democrat, and in fact the Clantons were the sort of the guys who counted the returns when they had their. Doesn't this sound familiar?
yes.
The returns when they had they decided who the candidate would be, and so it was all, of course, quite fraudulently done. But they were local poll officers for the Democratic Party, and they took it very seriously. And the McLaurys, I don't know. I think the McLaurys just happened to be unlucky. They were just there on the wrong day.
One thing that in every film, it's traditionally from the Earp's perspective, right? They're the lawman, and it's varied. And the fact that you brought up that there are Clanton and McLaury sympathizers who think that their depiction is not quite accurate in these films, because they're always the preeminent cowboy criminal. This is the guy who lives off the back of his horse. They're not real smart.
Clanton, yeah. But then in some movies he becomes like this master politician villain played by Robert Ryan,
right.
Who's kind of controlling the countryside, from his ranch. And these were not wealthy guys. I mean, these were cowboys, who rustled cattle and dealt in and sold stolen cattle to the butchers in Tombstone, who were quite happy to receive it and pass it on to the restaurants and the bars owned by their deadly enemies. So it was all a system that was functioning quite well until it got out of control that day. Partially because Ike got really drunk and issued threats against Holiday.
Yes. And I think that's one of the constants that we can consider a truth, was Ike Clanton was renowned for his inebriated temper, outbursts,
but so was Holiday.
Well,
so was Holiday. I mean,
yes,
and that's where I think historically it's the immovable force or irresistible force meets the immovable object. These two were so similar in their what we call by today's term as ragers, raging against everything. Silently until they get that point when that one whiskey or that one beer tops them over the edge, and then the dam bursts and they're like, ah, and I always wondered.
And there was also a stagecoach robbery in the background, and the suggestion that Holiday had actually been kind of involved on the periphery of it, and then kind of sold them out to the law. So there was a lot of bad feeling. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And that brings, so the question that I came up watching this and thinking about it was the depiction. So it's a documentary format in Tombstone Rashomon, which is really great because it's just classic. Makes it easy to follow, but it's so entertaining in how the characters represent the story that they're telling. And to me, it seemed that on the Earp side, it's almost like their recounting of the events was resting heavily on the shoulders of public belief. We're the Earps. We have, this legendary history. Everyone knows us. We've been in dime store novels. And, when I say this is what happened, it's going to be believed. Whereas, like Ike Clanton and, just really digging deep into their boots to, this is the truth. I'm telling you, this is what happened. And I was wondering, is that just how I interpreted it, or was that anything to do with how it was written for the characters to present themselves?
Ike was, I think, a chaotic thinker. I'd suggest that even if he was an innocent man, his thought processes were chaotic and didn't lead to any kind of a desired outcome. And when he was giving testimony for Judge Spicer, he also, because he'd been poleaxed by the Earps, they'd hit him on the head with a gun barrel and knocked him unconscious. He was having terrible headaches, and so he was both, I imagine, when outside the court, he was not only drinking, but cocaine was prescribed as a remedy for headaches in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ike was, I imagine, quite delirious when he gave his testimony. He wasn't all there. And maybe he was always a chaotic thinker. And whereas the Earps, the Earps got together, they coordinated their testimony, and they also kept Doc out of the room. They didn't let Doc give any testimony because he just didn't know what he'd say.
Right.
But his voice is heard later, because after the Earps and Holiday were acquitted in Tombstone, their enemies pursued them in other states, and Doc was kidnapped by a bounty hunter in Colorado, and gave interviews to the press there, while he was trying to get his freedom, and saying how he must not be extradited back to Arizona because he'll be murdered, which was also quite possible and interesting. So although Doc didn't give testimony at the hearing, his voice comes through these newspaper interviews.
So, talking about kind of the writing side of it, Jim and I both write, but you've been a writer-director on a number of projects, and I'm kind of wondering what side draws you more, what side do you like more, or do you kind of see them as sides of the same coin?
Well, no, writing is really fun. Writing itself is wonderful because you're not influenced by hardly anything else. I mean, sometimes you should be. If you're writing for pay, you should be paying attention to what your paymaster really wants. Even if they don't say what it is, you might be able to intuit it. But writing is like really pure and fun. And then directing is a lot more work. Directing is more difficult and more time consuming, more fraught with all kinds of interaction.